Ain't nobody pipe game worth going to hell over. It ain't, his stroke ain't that nice. All of the things we practice.
All right, we're going to get into it. We're going to get into it. If I had to give, well, actually, I need to do my intro. Bear with me, folks. This is your apostle, J-Wit. I have been sent to proclaim good news to the poor, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and to open the prison to those who are bound. We're going to do a quick breakdown that I like to call, if I had to give a title for tonight's or today's sermon, it would be Philip Anthony Mitchell and the Phenomenon of the Pulpit Shock Jock.
Ain't nobody pipe game worth going to hell over. It ain't, his stroke ain't that nice. All of the things we practice.
Let's pause here. Any discerning Black preacher knows his audience. One of the first things you got to know when you're going to speak to an audience is who they are. Maybe that's why I'm a voice of one crying in the wilderness right now. I don't even know who the audience is. Who wants to hear Apostle J-Wit? Who is he talking to? Who is the target demographic? Who's down to hear some person who's in the shadows analyzing the phenomenon of the pulpit shock jock, breaking down, doing anatomizing, if you will, the schemes and the scams of urban ministry? Well, one of the things we need to look at is his audience. Who is his audience?
Nobody pipe game.
Ask yourself, are there groups of men, generally speaking, in the urban area, in the cities, sitting around having conversations about the pipe gang of another man? Sure, there are. There are plenty of them. But who's the audience here laughing
Worth going to hell over.
and cheering his man on?
Nobody pipe game worth going to hell over. It ain't, his stroke ain't that nice.
Okay, so he's talking to the women, quite obviously, because I don't know the demographics are, but I've been in enough Black churches to know that they're replete, door to door, wall to wall, I should say, with pews full of women. All right, so he knows who he's talking to. But we have several themes here. We have there's always been pulpit shock jocks of sorts, but I think there's a unique, probably the poster child for the pulpit shock jock would have been Mark Driscoll. Circa the 2010s, the 2000s up to the 2010s, the early 2010s. He would have been and what are the features of the pulpit shock jock? Where do they come from? Well, prior to the 2000s, in the 90s and prior to that, the missionary movement, missions, was something that we looked at other places. And when I say we, I say Western nations. They looked at the nations in Asia. They looked at Africa. They looked at South America. They looked anywhere but in America. They looked anywhere but Europe, in fact. Europe was becoming more and more secular anyway. But a lot of the missions movement was housed right here in America. And we looked at other places. But what happened? What happened in the early 2000s? What happened that made us to start looking at our own nation and our own cities? Well, we started, some of the secularization of Europe started seemingly happening here. Our urban centers became increasingly irreligious. Our urban centers became increasingly skeptical of religion. Whereas there was always a skeptical lot within urban areas, coastal areas, places like LA, places like New York, places that were densely populated and pluralistic. Why? Because it's easy to sell a bill of goods to a monolithic group, a group that is where you have a certain kind of cultural hegemony. But when you get other groups of people in that can question and challenge some of your assumptions, some of the assumptions that go unchallenged as a result of basically the monolithic nature of any ethnic block or cultural block. You're a fish within water. You can't ask a fish about water. A fish doesn't even know that water is a thing. He thinks that's just the way one exists, is to take the water in and to. I want to use the analogy of breathing, but I'm not even sure what you would call it. To take in the water and to, expel it. Well, similarly, in these urban centers, when you have a pluralism, a certain kind of plurality of culture, diversity, it tends toward diversity. Why? Because you can't get along if you don't end up becoming more liberal when you have diversity. It's just the natural result of diversity to be more liberal. What does this lead to? It leads to skepticism of religion. It often leads to irreligion. And so the stronghold Christianity will have in places where they're ethnically monolithic, et cetera, you won't have that kind of stronghold in areas that are more diverse. And that's why the areas that are more diverse typically are the more liberal. So what happens is these missionary groups start realizing we're losing our cities. Whereas, this skeptical lot or group or faction within these coastal areas, these very diverse and pluralistic areas, used to be a smaller percentage. It's now growing. I'm talking by the time we get to the late 90s, the early 2000s, you find they already realize they're losing a grip on the cities. And what happens is this missional movement. We must capture, and these, Together for the Gospel, the Desiring God did their conferences. The Gospel Coalition. What we need to do is we need to establish an intellectual credibility for Christianity within the urban center. So we need to have missions to the cities. So instead of sending pastors overseas to plant, now you had pastors being sent to LA, to New York, San Francisco. Oh gosh, this could lead to other episodes. We got to send people into these areas where there's a parallel to the previous white flight and then the gentrification, actually, too. Because interestingly enough, in white flight, they left the cities and the churches went to the suburbs. But when gentrification happened, when people started rediscovering, hey, we want to live in the hub of culture, they start coming back and what do you know? Urban missions becomes a thing. So there's a way in which one can look at urban missions as the Christianized version of gentrification. And there's a sense in which missions has always had this cultural imperialistic element to it. Okay, you say, how does this relate to this black man here on the screen yelling about a person's pipe game? Let me rewind this, right?
Ain't nobody pipe game worth going to hell over. It ain't.
What do you do when you have to capture an audience that's urban with the message of the gospel in this pluralistic society? Well, maybe the old is it's like in gaming. What impressed someone in 1990 is not going to impress the average 13-year-old now. The graphics have to be better. The game, it's a whole different game. So your grandmother's Christianity isn't going to work for this group of urbanites. You're going to need a new version of Christianity, one that embraces their culture, one in which the man can come out with a chain, his Cuban link, and his polo sweater. He can come out and proclaim a certain kind of gospel to you that may have not been presented in the same way, a sort of unfettered from the trappings of previous pulpit etiquette, right? So here we have Philip Anthony Mitchell in the pulpit screaming about people's pipe game, The same way Driscoll would have been screaming in the 2010s about the Song of Songs or something. It's a way to try to contextualize this very antiquated message and make it feel relevant. There are problems with this all the way through, though. It's replete with problems.
His stroke ain't that nice.
Again, who is he talking to? His stroke ain't that nice. He's talking to the women, right? He's talking to the women because he's addressing them first. You're going to see he's later going to address the men, but because he knows that's his dominant audience. And they're going to think he's so real for, I mean, they're ready. They sound like they're at a basketball game or something.
All of the things we practice, the Lord says, when you see them in your life, cut them off.
He's an iteration of this pulpit shock jock that you see found in Mike Todd, who had his whole saliva debacle during the pandemic and so forth. This is the same trick. Let's keep it real. Keep it real, equals lowest common denominator communication. Find the buzzwords, find the colloquialisms, the slang, the jargon, use it even in its most crude form within the pulpit to show that you're in touch. And thus you can reach this urban audience. You can show that Christianity isn't the Bronze Age book that it actually is. I said book. Religion that it actually is what I mean.
For all the dudes, even like me, that struggled with lust, you love hips on Instagram like your wife is not enough.
Let's stop right there. You love hips. You struggle with lust, right? So we talked about the etiology, how they tried to explain death using sin, and then used the sin to explain other sin. In Romans 5, Paul uses sin, not in Genesis 3, but in Romans 5, Paul uses the original sin of Adam and Eve to explain sin present in people now. But what you have people who make the argument. No, it's the argument that Jackie Hill Perry made in the video I put up last week, where it says, look, grace is a divine idea. The divine idea of sin or all these other like this is not something human beings would come. We wouldn't demonize. We would not render the thing that we have a natural penchant for to be sinful. Why would we do that? Well, sure you would. If you got to keep people perennially on their knees begging for forgiveness, you got to have something that they have to be forgiven for. What could that be other than something that is so intrinsic to your being? Something like, hey, what, attraction? You take sexual attraction and you call it lust, and now you keep a person on their knees. That's a totally good reason for a human being to say sexual attraction is sinful. But what is sexual attraction? Let's just take a look at it. What does he say here? What does he say here?
For all the dudes, even like me, that struggled with lust, you love hips on Instagram.
He shapes hips with his hands, and he says, you love hips. Why do you love hips? If you take away sexual attraction and you take away sexual pleasure, how likely do you think it is for people to reproduce? Could it be that just like in every other species that's on this planet that has two sexes, the tendency is toward sexual attraction toward sexually mature individuals within the species? Why? Why is he shaping hips with his hands? Why, he's shaping it because why are men drawn to these things? Because they denote sexual maturity. And if it weren't for this, many people, you see people who didn't plan to have kids who end up having kids. Why? Because they couldn't resist their impulses, their natural urges to be attracted. So you've taken a thing that's totally natural, like sexual attraction, and you've demonized it, you've rendered it a sin. Now a person is always finding themselves sinning. They find this urge there. Why? Because it's a natural urge. It's the thing that has led to them being there. You know that you who are listening to this video are the result of many people being attracted to somebody and even maybe against their better judgment, having sex with the person and producing offspring. You're here. You're the end of a line of many people doing that. And maybe perhaps you have a child of your own and you have kept it going, maybe unwittingly. Is it because of sin, or is it just because this is the tendency of life on this planet? It's to self-preserve. Anyway, let's keep listening.
Like your wife is not enough. You stroll and you stop. You feel conviction and you don't move.
The conviction is just sociological. It's something that you've been programmed by sitting in a theater listening to this guy while the room is dark, entertain you with total like BS, programming you to think that something that is totally normal, like being attracted to someone, is a sin. And you're convicted, of course, that I can't take away from your feelings of conviction. You're convicted because you bought into an idea. You can be convicted by any idea you buy into. The Muslim is similarly convicted. Whatever religion you're in, you can be convicted based on that. But that inner conviction isn't a sign of anything going on actually in the real world in terms of, I shouldn't say anything on. It's going on in you. You're having this dilemma, but once you rid yourself of the falsehood, the ideologies that all of this nonsense is built on, you don't have the conviction.
Lord said for all of the sins, watch, you practice with unrepentance. He says, man, recognize it, see it, cut it off.
Yeah.
Not worried about the atheist.
Yeah, and of course the atheist catches a stray here, right?
I'm worried about you. You more deceived than they are.
Yeah, the atheist is deceived because he recognizes, or she recognizes, that this is nonsense. That you're being fed a bunch of lies about who you are. It's nothing wrong with being attracted to people. There's nothing inherently sinful about that.
At least they know they don't believe in God, but you got a false assurance while you claim in Christ and living in sin.
Yeah, scream at me some more. Scream at me some more. That's what the shock jock does. Scream and yell. Talk in the most lewd way. We're going to point really quickly at maybe where they get the template is right there in the text, actually, to be as lewd. But it's interesting that now you're finding, like I said, your grandmother's Christianity isn't going to work now. So they're getting, they got the Cuban link on in the polo shirt. That's what that's where we're at now. And they have to talk about pipe game out of the pulpit to keep you there. What's next?
He's going to say, depart from me, you worker of iniquity. You love sin. I never knew you.
All right. So we're going to pull up Ezekiel 23. Ezekiel 23, we're going to go into verse 19. Here you have basically a fictional story that the prophet Ezekiel was writing up. But he's basically, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, it's been a while. Actually, I should give a little background here. And when I was a Christian, at some point I realized I hadn't actually read through the Bible from cover to cover. And boy, was I surprised when I started committing myself to reading through it at least once or twice a year. And I would read through it every year. And I remember coming across this passage and just being shocked by how X-rated it is. What you'll find here is there's a sister named Oholibah. And he's using her, I think it's some sort of reference to Israel being, wayward. And he says, let's see, I may be wrong on this. It's been a while. I'm going for the juicy X-rated stuff so you guys can see what's going on here. He says, yet she increased in her whoring. Notice this is another thing. It's not preserved so much in the newer translations, but this is when I speak about the inherent misogyny of the text. So many times Israel is compared to the wayward wife or a whore, and what you'll find is even when you go to Revelations 21:8, he says whoremongers have. You understand that the pejorative they use for a male who's sexually lacks discretion or a serial philanderer, they'll say a whoremonger, at least in the KJV, right? So you can't even get away from the misogyny when you're denoting that a man is the person that's the target of the pejorative. He's a whore. He's mongering with horrors. You still got to get the shot. Just like the atheist caught the stray, the woman catches the stray in your statement about the man and his sexual indiscretion. But anyway, moving on. Yet she increased her whoring, remembering the days of her youth when she played the whore in the land of Egypt and lusted after her lovers there, whose members were like those of donkeys and whose issue was like that of horses. So there you have it. Right there in Ezekiel, him saying that that this Israel or whatever is whoring after a donkey and horse peen. This is crazy. But as I said, these are the passages that you're not going to hear. As I was saying, when I was reading through, I was shocked. You don't hear this being preached through and walked through. And the women who sit in the audience, nobody stops to think, why does the illustration always have to be the woman who's running off after? Why? That's all I challenge people to do. I shouldn't say that's all. I'm challenging them to do many things. One of the things I'm challenging them to do is just to picture and imagine a text that's more balanced with less of the horror language, and maybe occasionally let's talk about the man who's doing something. Like, let's use that as an illustration. Why does it always? That's what I mean by the inherent misogyny. And you've gotten so used to the language, you don't even question the fact that it's inherently misogynist. In fact, maybe you think because it's of divine origin, it can't be inherently misogynistic. So it's just right for it to be using women repeatedly as horrors and as an illustration for infidelity to make a point about Israel, when it could be done in any number of ways. It'd be like when they would say, I never forget Phyllis Wheatley, what she said, Negroes as black as Cain can such and such join the angelic train. It's like, why would you use that? If you can use that illustration, I mean, why not use some other illustration? Like, why are you constantly trapping on this people group? Why is it constantly women are the negative representation? Is even I think it's Ezekiel where he speaks of can the leopard change his spots or the Ethiopian change his skin? Neither can you, who are basically accustomed to doing evil, change that. It's like, why are you using the color of an Ethiopian skin to as an analogy to why a person can't change? I mean, if a person said that now, I should finish that sentence, can't stop sinning. Why would that be the parallel? Doesn't it seem like you're almost drawing a parallel between? Now, somebody would say, "Oh, he's not saying there's something wrong," but yeah, but why am I catching the stray in that illustration? You see, that's the question here. So why is it constantly? But I'm going off. That's another tangent. We can't get off to that today. But yeah, let's listen.
Ain't nobody pipe game worth going to hell over.
Yeah, enough of this. Enough of the Philip Anthony Mitchell's, the phenomenon of the pulpit shock jock, these people who feel like they have to contextualize it, and they have to do it by using all of the colloquialisms, all of the slang, and they got to get down in the gutter and they got to talk to you about that. Why? Because they got to make it look like it's cool, and they're going to do it to the raging audience. That's just up in arms. They just love it.
Nobody pipe game worth going to hell over.
He even give you the visual illustration. He looks down when he says it, right?
Nobody pipe game worth going to hell over. His stroke ain't that nice.
Yeah. You know why? Nobody's pipe game is worth going to hell over, because you're not going to hell over anybody's pipe game. All right. Good day, folks. I hope this was an enjoyable one.